Hello, everyone, and welcome to In Opportunities Podcast, Accessibly Average Gamers Podcast. I'm Byron, also known as Rez. I'll be your host today. We have Spencer out, so I'm going to be running the podcast and our technical side too. So I'll be producing and hosting. so, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Kyle, and tell us about your game?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Kyle Creamer. I'm a developer from Toronto, in Canada, and I made OmniCube, which is a really hard block sliding puzzle game. It's basically sort of a logical puzzle game. You sort of slide blocks around a grid and try to maneuver them into the corresponding goal squares and a few more complications. But that's sort of the quick intro on it.
Yeah, and I did have a chance to play it, and honestly,
Awesome.
it was very good quality. There was a little humor added in there with the OmniCube, and the levels designs were really well. And I think I just barely made it out of the tutorial, and they were already giving me pause. I started playing it,
Uh,
and I was really tired, and I got to a level I was like, you know what? I don't know if I have the brain power for this right now.
Yeah, that's maybe the highest compliment you can give me. I really it's always been sort of I think it's not a totally uncommon criticism of, games that can sometimes, skew towards the easy side these days. And so
Yeah.
I always, really enjoyed really hard puzzle games, and I tried to very much cater to that. So yeah, people have definitely expressed some, like, I can't, get past level 14, or, that to me is like the highest form of praise for OmniCube.
Yeah, it was great. The different types of I don't know how you say it, but the puzzle design, like you have the squares that are traps that you'll fall into, and I'll go ahead and throw it up on here so the people can see it. Um, and you have to stop them here. Like you can't just stop them where you want them. Like as you can see on the screen, like you have to get it just right. You got to use your cubes to work just right. So some of them are definitely even just out of just barely out of tutorial are not like you can't just boom 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 do it. Like it takes some time, and I think that's one of the hardest parts in making a puzzle game is designing the different levels and making them different. How about you go ahead and explain, go a little bit into that and how you design the levels?
Yeah, absolutely. So the sort of core inspiration, if anyone's ever played like I'm sure many of our audience has the Pokemon, Game Boy games. It's sort of like the inspiration of it is when you're sort of on the sheet of ice and you're sort of sliding from block to block. But it's a similar idea where you need a block to be sort of the stopper tile to stop a block from moving. And so it is a challenge, definitely, because you don't want the puzzles to feel repetitive, and that's something that I tried to very much keep in mind when I was designing it. It's ultimately a fairly constricted set of mechanics, like you're sliding the blocks around, and there are a few little flourishes, like you said. There are the tiles where you can get trapped in, and it's sort of like a pit where if you fall in, you get a game over. And there are also bomb tiles, or bomb blocks, I should say, that you can slide into a wall and destroy the wall to sort of create new paths. So there are a few mechanics like that that sort of mix up the gameplay, but at its core, it's really just sliding blocks around and trying to sort of visualize how you're going to get them to the goal. I played a lot of competitive chess for a few years, and so that was also a bit of the sort of ethos of the game, is like sort of really building some puzzles that you can sort of sit and really kind of have to plan out how you're going to solve it, and everything sort of needs to be in a very particular place, especially in the later levels. In order, a lot of times people will get all the blocks except for one, and even though it feels like you're very close to a solution, you may or may not actually be. So, um, yeah, I read a lot when I was designing the puzzles about just sort of puzzle design philosophies, and one of the things that I read that was really influential on me was an article I read about good puzzle design revolves around making, at first, one level to illustrate basically every core mechanic. And so I tried to sort of follow that progression where, the first level, all you have to do is slide the block around and get it into the goal. And then we progress to having multiple blocks, and then blocks of different colors, and they have to go into the matching colored goal. And so you sort of introduce that concept, do a level where the only thing you have to do is blow up one wall with one bomb block. And so I tried to sort of introduce the mechanics in that very sort of step by step way. And then what you do is basically you pick two mechanics and now try to design a level where you need to sort of understand both.
Mm-hmm.
And so by sort of mixing and matching mechanics in that way, each level sort of has a sort of unique, like, okay, you need this mechanic and that's sort of what makes it unique. And so you can sort of get a lot of permutations with not even that expansive of a mechanic set. And so in Omnicube there are 60 levels, and that is, a pretty decent amount of content. And I do think most of the levels have a pretty unique spin to them.
Yeah, when you mentioned the chess, that totally clicked. Like I totally
Yeah,
see that now that after I played it, and now you say that, like it's like yeah, I totally see that because I used to play chess as a kid.
yeah, yeah.
I enjoyed it, like and even the layout of it, like that makes a lot of sense. And I think that the amount of content that you have is really good for a puzzle game. Um, I haven't played a lot of puzzle games because I'm not that my brain doesn't necessarily work that way. I'll get
Yeah,
frustrated quick.
that's totally fair. Totally fair.
But I actually was sitting there playing this and I was enjoying it. I was like I felt like I wanted to keep playing it, which is unusual for me on a puzzle game. So
For you for a puzzle game. Yeah,
yeah,
well, I'm happy to hear it.
that's
Yeah.
very well done. So with the content, the amount of content you have, and then the price, which is $6.99, right?
Yeah.
How did you decide how much the game was worth? But off of your time you put into it, the amount of content,
Yeah.
based off of
So
what's out there as well.
yeah, there was a lot of anxiety about setting the price, including even the pricing model, because we might touch on this a bit later, but OmniCube was in development for quite a long time. And I remember initially, a lot of people, it was sort of uh, just the beginning of the avalanche of games that made in-app purchases like a really big thing in sort of the mobile game space. And a lot of people were saying, "Oh, do that! Find a way to do that with OmniCube." And so, way back when I first designed it, that we were even thinking of doing some sort of like freemium sort of model for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it just ended up not. I mean, it doesn't really make sense given the mechanics. Like
Right.
it makes way more sense to just be like, okay, it's a puzzle game and it's a premium product, and you buy it and then you have all the puzzles and that's sort of it. It makes way more sense that way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, to be honest, I went back and forth. Initially, I had actually thought about pricing it a little bit lower because I was nervous. It's my first like real sort of commercial release as a developer, and I'm always sort of anxious about, well, I'm an unknown quantity, and I think the puzzle design is good and it's a compelling game, but it's not the most unique concept that's ever been invented. And so I was very anxious about pricing it. But one game that I took a lot of inspiration from, actually, I don't know if you've ever played or you probably have heard of it, is Steven's Sausage Roll.
I've heard of it. I've never actually seen it or played it.
Sure, yeah, but it's sort of a similar thing, except on a much grander scale. It's like these sort of really hard puzzles, and I read a lot of stuff the developer of that game said, which is, we tried to sort of imagine a price point where he said the metric for deciding his price was sort of like, if we cut our price in half, do we really think twice as many people would buy it? And there's sort of a fine line where, like, if you go from like $2 to $1, are twice as many people going to buy it? Maybe not. And so we tried to sort of just suggest a few prices and sort of see, like, does that feel right? And we compared it to other games sort of in the similar genre of, like, these sort of standalone puzzle games. And I think ultimately we settled on something that makes a lot of sense. Like $6.99. The thing is, like, our game's a little bit niche in the sense, like, take yourself for example. Like, you're not really someone who is going to seek out puzzle games, but for the
Right.
people that
Right.
are, but for the people that are into a puzzle game, like, if a puzzle game sort of hooks you, it's almost like you're sort of going to get it if it's $6.99 or if it's $4.99.
Right. Right.
And so that was sort of our philosophy of, like, if we went from $6.99 to $4.99, are 30% more people going to buy it? Like, probably not. It's probably going to be roughly the same sort of niche. And so we sort of did some of the decision on the price based on that, if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Actually, that's that's the most in-depth answer I've had to that question, and it sounds like you really thought
Yeah,
it
I
out.
mean, I spent a lot of nights just really being
Yeah.
anxious, like, oh my God, if I price this wrong, no one's going to buy my game and it's going to be the worst thing ever. Steven Sausage Roll actually went in a really extreme direction, and they said, well, this is basically the hardest puzzle game in the whole space, and they priced their game at I think $25 or $30. For it's similar to OmniCube but much more expansive, and so it's more content, so it makes sense. But to me, like there's a lot of sort of like people were like, really, like that's so high. But
Yeah.
yeah, as someone who sort of seeks out puzzle games, I was like, I want to play this no matter what.
Yeah.
So I,
Yeah.
that didn't really deter me. So yeah, that's sort of there's a lot of thought that went into the pricing. I'll like say that for sure.
Yeah, and that's something that we're always curious about is what is the thought that goes into it, because that seems like it would be very hard as a content creator, as an artist, because game design, game development, I believe is an art.
Absolutely.
Like, how do you decide what that your time's worth that you put into it based off of, too, like your competition, and what people are going to be willing to pay, because uh, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of work. Like, for instance, how much time did you put into this game?
Yeah, so we can definitely get into this. It's sort of an embarrassing thing to me because uh, I had worked on a lot of smaller projects before I started OmniCube, and none of them really felt to me like this is a finished commercial thing that I could sell and put on Steam. And I really wanted that sort of in my development catalog, and so I set out to make OmniCube. The number one goal is to make something very simple so that I could focus on polishing it up and making it look, like sort of a finished professional product.
Mm.
And so I literally the core idea for OmniCube was what's like the most simple mechanic that I can think of, which I will explore very deeply, but I don't want to get caught up in like programming something that's very complicated. I want to mostly work on the sort of craftsmanship of it. And so I am it's kind of embarrassing to me, but I started working on it in September of 2014, which is 4 years ago, which is crazy because it obviously doesn't take 4 years to make OmniCube, functionally speaking. But
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of the thing that always caused the sort of development to go longer and longer was the idea of like every time I would do an iteration of the art and sort of the UI of it, it would not feel done or good
Mm-hmm.
enough to me. And so I would say, well, maybe I'll do it slightly differently and make it look differently, and would end up in sort of a month later another sort of design idea that still didn't feel like enough to me. And I'd always had in my mind this idea of like you see these developers who make these crazy, one man projects,
Yeah.
and they do the art and they do the sound and they do the everything. And that appeals to me because I have a lot of fun doing all that stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
my skill set is very much in the sort of programming and just puzzle design part of it, and I am very much not I don't have the art skills to really at least make OmniCube into what I had hoped it to be. So I did spend a very, very long time on it, sort of ended up redesigning it a lot. And I worked on OmniCube very part-time at certain points. I had, just like other jobs and stuff that I was working on. So yeah, it was definitely, in terms of like time put in, back to the original point of like, how did that factor into the price? It just like, I could never make back, the amount of time I put into it. But really, the goal of it was to, as I said, I just wanted a published commercial game that looked professional, and so I do feel like that goal was achieved. In terms
Definitely.
of the pricing, we just tried to figure out something that people thought was reasonable because there was we had to price at $1 million a copy to
Yeah.
make back all the time we spent on it.
Well, one of the advantages you have with something like a puzzle game like you created, you don't have to worry about like it becoming obsolete. Like if you take your time,
Mm-hmm.
you put into it, like it looks professional, it looks good, it functions well. There's no bugs, it doesn't stutter, like it runs very smoothly, and like it's not something you have to worry about. Like that could be something that people are playing 10 years from now, and
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
not going to. People aren't going to look back at me and like, oh, this just doesn't hold up. Like it's the type of game, and I think the way you designed it, like it will hold up, which is really cool. I think. Um,
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad. Yeah, I think the challenging puzzle game it's got a timeless aspect to it for sure.
right, right, exactly. I mean,
Yeah,
chess is still played thousands of years later.
exactly, exactly. Yeah.
So you said you started working out in 2014. So is game development your full time job, or do you have another job that you do?
For most of the time, I worked. So my background is in computer science, so I've worked as a software engineer for most of the time that I have been developing games. I really started making like developing video games and programming them and stuff at around that time, like 2013, 2014. And I was in school when I started, like university, and then I sort of moved on to some software engineering jobs. And pretty much I would just try and like save away as much money as I could. And um, my goal was to save up enough to sort of like give myself a dedicated, chunk of time to really focus on game development.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, but I work on it part time still right now, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. And I in the job that I work, you'd be the one that I'd be calling to fix my problems. Software engineers, they're my best friend.
Absolutely.
So, what you spoke a little bit about? What was the game? Sausage something. Is that your inspiration for this game?
Steven Sausage Roll.
Steven
Yeah. So
Sausage
I
Roll.
did. Yeah, it's great. By the way, if anyone listening who's not played it or seen it or heard of it, it's kind of absurd, but it's got the guy that made it is a total genius. Like he's the best puzzle designer that I've ever seen. But I didn't discover that game until probably 2016. So I had already coded all the mechanics for OmniCube. I'd made
Okay.
basically all the puzzles at that point.
Hmm.
So it's the kind of game I wish I had seen because at the time that I was making OmniCube, I mean I'm sure there are hard puzzle games out there that I've not seen, but there was none in sort of the zeitgeist of like a hard puzzle game that people were sort of like talking about a lot on like Twitter or whatever. Like that was sort of a hard puzzle game that was also very popular. And Steven Sausage Roll, at least in the sort of circles that I was following, very much became that game. And it was sort of like a reassuring thing to me of like, okay, so like the sort of appetite for this type of game most definitely exists, and I would go on and I would see people talking about Steven Sausage Roll and they'd be stuck on this level and they'd be like, F this game, like it's too hard, it's whatever. And you'd see the developer kind of be like, haha, like that's kind of it's like in a way that's what I want you to feel. I want you to be challenged by this.
Right.
And people responded to it in a really appealing way to me. Like that's what I wanted people to feel when they played OmniCube.
Hmm.
And it's not as expansive as Steven Sausage Roll, but it's I think in that same sort of vein. But no, very much the inspiration of where the game started came a couple years before that. I was playing competitive chess, like pretty much full time for a couple of years, and the idea for OmniCube came from doing chess puzzles.
Hmm.
And you'd sort of sit down with a book and you'd have a position and you'd have to sort of figure out the best move, and you would sit and stare at it for a while and you'd try to think of all these possibilities, and then eventually you'd sort of have that aha, like that's what you do. And that really, like, chess was the sort of inspiration for OmniCube, and then Steven's Sausage Roll was sort of like the reassurance halfway through of like, okay, this is a thing that people want.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Chase. Finally made a stream. If you have any questions, throw them in. We'll ask. And so yeah, the chess side of it that definitely makes sense, and that's it's very unique. I think I also thought of it seemed like just kind of the UI of the game reminded me of what is it? I think it's like Mahjong or something that came on Windows PCs or something.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Where you
Yeah,
would match the.
yeah. Kind of a
Yeah,
throwback to that.
I
When
could
you're
kind of see
bored.
that. It's not the first thing that jumps out to my mind. I do love me some mahjong though. That was, I played a lot of that game when I was a kid.
Yeah. Um, so with how does somebody go from competitive chess to video game creation?
Yeah, so basically, I said that I started making video games in 2013, but really I've sort of been like making up games more broadly ever since I was like a little kid. Like I grew up playing uh, Nintendo consoles my whole life, and I would make before I knew how to program, I still had this urge to sort of make games, and I would make up pencil and paper games, for my little brothers to play, and I would design these like RPG quests with our action figures. Like I was very much always
Oh,
wanting
that's
to,
awesome.
yeah, I was very much
That's
always
awesome.
wanting to make these games,
Hmm.
but I didn't have any notion of like, oh, you could program this. Like the thing that always upset me when I was a kid is like, if I wanted someone to play my game, I would have to sit with them and enforce the rules myself. And I was like, I just wish there was a way for this to like run itself so people could play it. Like in my mind, just like the the hole in my heart was being able to program it for something that could run when I wasn't there. But I didn't
Right.
really know about that as a kid. But I very much always made games. And then, yeah, it was kind of a weird story of how I got into chess. I just sort of got a bit interested and met some people in the community and got more and more involved in it for a couple of years. And really, chess took up a lot of time. Like it's a very serious pursuit. And so the
Right.
people that are competitive chess players, it's like oftentimes like all they do,
Right. Right.
outside of work and stuff. And I was very much in that world for a while, and it just sort of like woke up one day and was like, I'd rather be making games than focusing my time on chess. And so that's sort of how the transition happened. But there was parts of chess that are in my soul forever, like this sort of puzzle solving, sort of methodology and
Hmm.
that moment of inspiration. And so even though I didn't play chess anymore, I sort of wanted to imbue that in my games, at least in OmniCube for sure.
Right. So, is it hard to explain to like friends and family like what you do for a living? Like, this is part time. I think you said, but is that kind of hard to explain what your hobby is, what your passion is?
First, it's depending on the degree of separation. Like my parents, for example, saw me playing games like every day growing up. Like, so they totally get it. They're like, okay, if that's what you're making, that's fine.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, maybe people that weren't living in my house, like my uncles and grandparents, and they're sort of like they don't get it at all.
Yeah.
But a lot of my friends are people I met through computer science, so it's a very familiar pursuit to them. So
Hmm.
yeah, I would say I've never really encountered that problem. Like I think most people sort of uh, get it. I think a lot of people understand the idea of wanting to make games, but I don't think a lot of people understand what goes into making a game. They're
Right.
sort of like, oh, why don't you make some like why don't you just make Candy Crush like this weekend? Make something just like that, but change the art. And like
Right.
that's a really successful game. You could be a millionaire by next Wednesday. Like, it's it's the process is poorly understood, I'll say that.
Right, which is part of the reason why we do this podcast. We want to shine some light, on video game creation, especially the indie side. We love indie games. My co-host Spencer, he's more of an aficionado of
Sure.
indie games. I'm more, like I said, do more of the technical stuff on this side. But
Yeah.
we love video games, and we just wanted to shine some light, on video game creation because, as I said earlier, like I really believe it's an art, and we want to show people that.
Yeah, 100%. And I love that you guys are doing this. And it's definitely something that, it's like almost a bit of a trope in the game development sphere of like the idea guy who like wants to make a game and is like, well, all I need to do is just, I need someone to program it and I need someone to make the art and that's sort of it. It's easy. Like, but the craftsmanship that goes into it is pretty complicated, or not even that I should say it's complicated, but it's very multidisciplinary. And that sort of
Hmm.
goes back to what I was talking about with OmniCube, where like I know how to program and I sort of, through my pencil and paper games, I have sort of a mind for designing puzzles,
Hmm.
but I have no art skills. And it's like, making a game requires such a sort of disparate set of skills that, yeah, it's a very interesting medium, but certainly an
Definitely.
art form.
So you worked on this all by yourself, right? Everything is you.
Well, so no, actually, I programmed it and
Okay.
I did the puzzle design. But
Hmm.
actually, so as I said, I did so many redesigns on OmniCube, and it just never really looked good. And so, actually, in 2016, I teamed up with a couple of other people to work on the 3D art. So I
Hmm.
worked with a guy, very talented guy, Doug Braun from I think he lives in Vancouver now. He did the 3D modeling for me, and then I worked with a sound designer and musician named Harrison Brooks, and he did the music for the game. So it was a collaborative effort by the time it was released, definitely.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, the UI design, everything about it, like it looks crisp, it looks professional. So that was a very good team. Kudos
Yeah, thank
to
you.
the
I mean,
designer.
props to them because I can tell you that had I tried to release one of my earlier versions, it would not like that is all Doug, and it looks great now. But yeah, that was one of the really key lessons I took away from OmniCube is you know the idea of sort of the one man developer. Many people are very successful with that if you sort of have the skill set, But
Right,
for
right.
me, I wish so much that back in 2014, I had reached out and found somebody in the beginning because you can definitely put in the time and improve your art skills or whatever. Maybe there's an artist who doesn't know how to program. It's sort of whichever skill set you're lacking,
Hmm.
you can definitely learn that. And that's very fun. But ultimately, for me, it's just like I was never going to get results this good. And so that's like the number one piece of advice I would go back and give myself in 2014. It's just like, you're not an artist and you can do it for fun. But if you want OmniCube to look good, find someone who is very skilled at this and get them to help you, or hire them, or whatever the arrangement is. But definitely, like, collaborating with talented people in their domains is like it wouldn't have taken 4 years for OmniCube to release had I known that when I started.
Well, so say there is a young developer out there who's looking to do this. How did you find the people to collaborate with? What are the different ways that they can find people to collaborate on a video game with?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's something I spent a lot of time on. The thing that I wanted to do originally was sort of go on different forums and maybe find somebody to collaborate through that, or on Twitter or something. And I found that to be not so effective because um, there's some sort of ineffable quality to like meeting somebody in person, or at least meeting someone through a person in real life. And that's how I ended up finding both my artist and the musician that we worked with. Like, they were both people I met either through the musician was a chess player, and I met him through chess.
That's cool.
And the other guy I met just through I just went to sort of like developer meetups and would talk to people, and I would just be very open about, hey, I'm making a game and I'm looking for an artist, and if you know anybody, please refer them to me. Or if you know someone who might know someone, like, I'm just looking for contacts. And so for finding my artist, it was a very deliberate networking effect. I had found some people, like, you go on these sort of like subreddits or different forums and
Right.
stuff, and you'll find people that are um, looking to find partners, and that very well may work for some people, but it didn't work for me because it's a hard relationship to forge in a certain sense, especially if you're not like well funded, which we were not. Like,
Right.
it's a plight of indie developers where, like, if you could hire somebody, well, if you're paying them like a big salary or something, you have their full attention. But when it's often not the case that that's what you're dealing with, it's hard to find a similar level of commitment and enthusiasm, especially if you're the one sort of driving the game and you're trying to bring someone on. Like, you care about your game more than anyone in the world, and it's hard to find someone who's going to be seriously invested. And so, for whatever reason, I found a lot more success just like going to developer meetups and talking to my contacts who I knew through school or friends or whatever. And I found that to be a much more tangible way to get someone that was going to be as serious as I was. So,
Right.
your mileage may vary, but that's what worked for me, I'd say.
Okay. Yeah. Other developers that we've interviewed, that they've said they found them through Reddit or game jams or whatever. But one of the biggest issues they always run into is dedication. Actually being able to rely on them to complete what they're supposed to
Yeah,
complete.
and it's tough. And I mean, we went through two or three actually different artists before we found Doug. Some of them were people that I had gotten in touch with through Reddit, and it's very discouraging and frustrating, especially because you spend a lot of time trying to like ramp them up and like pitch your vision and here's what we're going to work on, and you draw it all up, and then a couple weeks later they find a job or work with someone else, and it's just all totally gone. So it can be definitely be tough, but finally finding the person who had the skill set I didn't was like the most key thing to finishing my game. So it can be very worth it if you sort of do the legwork on it.
Yeah. It's Spencer, my co-host, spamming the chat with a bunch of stuff. I can't get to all of it, but we miss you, Spencer. We wish you were here.
We do, Spencer.
All right, so this is your first video game, right? This is your first project.
Yeah, it's definitely my first sort of like serious release. I did a lot of smaller game jam type stuff,
Hmm.
but this is my first, let's say, commercial project.
Okay. So what's
Um,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, what's the first video game you ever played? What got you into video games?
Oh, that's a fun question. So the first game I ever played, I was 2 years old, and we have an iconic picture in my house. It's me sitting on my dad's knee, and we're playing Super Mario Bros., like the original NES Super Mario
Nice.
Bros. I think that's probably a classic answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even like. Sometimes I read things on Reddit where people are like, "Hey, I'm playing video games with my son, and his controller's not even plugged in." Like, I sometimes read that, and then I look back at that picture, and I'm like, "Am I actually playing?"
Yeah.
I can't say with any confidence, but I do remember, playing like Super Mario Bros. At a pretty young age.
Yeah, I've done that
Um,
with my nephew. Just give him the controller has nothing in it. He's good to
yeah,
go.
look, if you press the buttons, you're controlling the enemies. But I remember more vividly when we got our Super Nintendo, which was probably in 1990. I don't know when it came out. 90, like we got ours in 90, like 4, 95. So I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, and I very vividly remember playing, the original Donkey Kong Countries.
Hmm.
Um, One game I was maybe too young for it. I'm obsessed with it now. Is Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars, which is for Super Nintendo. And I like didn't understand it at all when I was a kid, but I would still try to play it. And
Yeah.
now it's like one of my favorite games of all time.
Oh, awesome.
So yeah, but we were very much a Nintendo house growing up. I never really had like a lot of exposure to like PlayStation or Sega or any games that weren't in sort of the Nintendo hierarchy. So I
Yeah.
was always like Super Nintendo, N64, GameCube, and then I went to university. So that was sort of like my whole history with video games, all Nintendo stuff.
Nice. So what game is that? Is that a game you keep coming back to? Uh,
The Super Mario RPG.
mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I play it like once every couple years for sure. I've had like sort of like tried to speed run it against my brother. We like see who can like get through it more quickly. Like I love that game. I would love to like OmniCube was meant to be sort of a tightly scoped thing, which
Mhm.
it's crazy. It took me 4 years, but it did. But at some point, I would love to build something in the vein of like sort of RPG like that, where it's
Mhm.
got sort of these very kind of cartoony, bright graphics, and it's sort of like Mario, and it's not there's no sort of like gritty aspect to it. It's very like bubbly and fun, or it's sort of I'm sure you've heard of like the Paper Mario games, right?
I don't think I have
No, yeah, it's sort of a
paper.
similar idea where it's technically like an RPG set of mechanics, but they build a lot of humor into the game as
Okay.
well as sort of like funny, sort of snappy dialogue.
Mhm.
And it's sort of like the OmniCube almost, where like you go down and you talk to the OmniCube and he says these sort of sarcastic, sort of funny things, and the game doesn't necessarily take itself so seriously. That very much is a vibe that I like to put into my games, because sometimes I'll be developing and I'll just think of something funny, or you know, and I'm like, this would be, like I kind of want to share it through my game. So I always end up imbuing humor into my games in some capacity, and I think probably that a lot of that comes from these Mario RPG series games.
Yeah, it's funny. Spencer actually asked in the chat. He said to ask you about Paper Mario about 10 seconds after you said something about it on here.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm
Yeah.
not. I'm doing a very poor job of keeping up with the chat, but yeah, Paper
No,
Mario.
well, there's a slight delay for our stream, but I thought that was pretty funny. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
yeah, he's more like I said. He's definitely more the connoisseur of the indie games and just games in general.
Sure,
So we're definitely missing him on here. Uh,
that's okay.
we'll have to have you back again when we're all here.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a lot of fun.
So let's go ahead and pivot a little bit. I want to get a little bit into the business side. So I know we already spoke about how you decided how much to charge for it, which was a lengthy process.
Definitely.
But are you an official business? Do you have like an LLC, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a little bit different in Canada. I think LLC might be but we have a similar idea. LLC,
Hmm.
I think, is a United States construct. We have a very similar thing in Canada. Um, my business, as of right now, I think is a tier below that. In Canada, we call it like a sole proprietorship. I don't know if
Okay.
there's a similar
Yeah.
thing in
Yeah.
the States. Yeah, and so that I officially do have a business set up. It's called Trykon Studios, and we operate things through that. But it's not like a full corporation yet or anything like that. So I'm not like I sort of do. I think a lot of indie developers are like this in a certain sense, where I sort of like went through the process and got everything set up and sort of did what I had to do, and then that was sort of the end of it. Like
Yeah.
I spend as little time worrying about the business stuff as possible. But it is, it's important to get it all squared away and do it right.
So how does it work with your partners? Are they the employees, contractors?
Yeah, so the relationships with my collaborators are they're contractors.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we set up, it's actually kind of funny because you have this thing in a lot of indie relationships where uh it's a lot of people try to, because they don't have a lot of funding, they'll instead say, I want to pay you through like revenue share, basically.
Right.
So there's always that sort of conundrum of like, is this project going to work out? Is revenue share something that makes sense for me as a collaborator? Versus like just paying somebody for like, I want you to make these assets and then I'll pay you this lump sum, and that's sort of our contract.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually did one of each. So my music guy, we did a revenue share arrangement, and then the guy I worked with for the visuals, we just sort of negotiated like, this is roughly the scope, how long is it going to take you to make this, and then we sort of worked out a fixed price, and so we just like did it that way. So I sort of got a taste of both, and to be honest, they both worked out really well. So I guess it's kind of there's no, I guess, one size fits all answer in that
Right.
sense, but yeah, got a little bit of exposure to sort of both ways of doing business from that perspective.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm always curious about that, the business side of it. That's what I'm a little more interested in.
Yeah.
So how are you? How are you, and how did you market the game?
So that is another thing similar to the art that I'm pretty clueless about. And I think a lot of developers fall into
Most,
that.
yeah, most developers are that we
Yeah.
talk to.
So
Yeah.
it was basically the exact, it's all coming, it's like, why didn't I do this differently? But it was very similar to the art where I thought, I'm a one man sort of indie setup. I'll do it myself. Like there are definitely a lot of really great ways you can market yourself. You can do social media stuff. You can try to, reach out to people and get them to write about your game, or let's play, or, even stuff like your podcast. You can do a lot of stuff on your own,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a lot of work, and I did not anticipate that. I'm sure every developer says this, right? They're like, oh, I didn't realize marketing was a lot of work until I
Yeah.
had to do it. But I am very much, I fall into the exact same boat where I just sort of thought, well, I'll make the game and then I'll figure out the marketing later. And that was not great. But I realized before we launched the game that we didn't really have a good enough marketing plan, or, I didn't even really feel like I had the time to do it myself,
Uh-huh.
even if I knew how to do it, which I didn't. So we ended up working with, I reached out to a company called Novi Unlimited. And
Mm-hmm.
they basically do marketing for a lot of like indie games, and other sort of like indie art projects. And they were tremendous. They really like, because I didn't even know what questions to ask. I was like, I would go onto Steam and I would see these games and they'd have like nice, like, what you might think of as like box art, except it's not on a box. It's
Mm-hmm.
like a nice landing page art and like little promotional things with their characters, and it's like coming soon. And I was like, I don't even know what that's called. Like, to ask an artist to make that for me, I don't even know like the words to use to ask for that. But I knew I needed to have it because this
Right.
is what professional games look like. And so I reached out to Novi, and they helped us a lot, in terms of like first just like educating me on like, okay, that's called key art, and like, here's the other things you usually need. You need to have a trailer. You need to have like, social media presence for your game. You need to have this, this, and this. And they were, I mean, we would have been totally sunk without them. So
What is the oh, I would like to put that in chat. What is how do you spell that?
sure, it's Novy. Novi Unlimited, I think, is their official. I think their website, I'm looking up right now. It's novypr.com. So novypr.com. And yeah, they were awesome, and they've got, looks like, I'm just on their site right now. They've got like a couple of examples of stuff that they've worked with. Um, so yeah, for me, at least I had the sense at that point to know, like, I couldn't do it on my own, and the similar thing to the art, like pull someone in who sort of knows what they're talking about, and they helped us a lot.
That's cool. That's actually the first time I've heard of that company, and it sounds like it'd be a really good avenue for indie developers. So I want to get that out
Yeah,
there.
tremendous resource, and they do. I mean, the thing is, I think people get a little afraid, in terms of like, you know, because you just sort of like have to hire them, like they are going to be working. You guys work out a price for it, but they do sort of like, they work with a lot of indie arrangements, even as small as like one person companies, and they
Hmm.
work with bigger ones. And so they're very flexible about like, if you don't have a huge budget for your game, they're willing to sort of work with that, or, you know, try to sort of scope things according to your needs. They were really tremendous. So yeah, I would highly recommend them to anybody who sort of feels as clueless about marketing as I did.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
That's a really good piece of information there for other
yeah, yeah,
developers.
yeah, for sure.
So, how is your social media presence? How are you handling that? How do you get people excited about the game?
Yeah, we're doing okay. To be honest, like I would self-assess as I'm not uh, doing a phenomenal job of it. Like I made a development log on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with TIG Source.
I'm sure Spencer is. I'm not familiar with it.
I'm
I'm
sure
sure
Spencer,
Spencer
yeah,
is.
but
Yeah.
it's basically the indie game source, and they are sort of known for hosting like development logs and that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
I do some entries in that and tweet about it, and we have a Facebook page for Trykon Studios, and we try to if anything's happening with the game, like Novi did a really good job when we were working with them. They sort of did a lot of outreach to people writing blogs and different articles and stuff. And so anytime like a piece of content like that comes across my eyes or Novi's eyes, we sort of like tweet about it. And um, we did a lot of very focused social media stuff around the launch of OmniCube, which was at the end of May, I believe. Just trying to tweet out like I would because if people haven't seen the bottom side of the cube on which the game is set, there's a face that you can talk to, and that is
Hmm.
the OmniCube, so to speak. And so basically, I would write like custom snippets of text as said by the OmniCube, and sort of use that as like marketing. So like I'd make like I remember when the Venom movie was first announced. Yeah, there's the game up there. But yeah,
Yeah.
like I remember when the Venom movie was first announced, like everyone was tweeting about Venom. So I wrote a little blurb like joking about that as said by the OmniCube, and then I would sort of
Okay.
like tweet a GIF of that. So I tried to sort of like, target things uh to like what was sort of like popular and get some
Hmm.
attention that way. Like, when Bitcoin was going crazy, the OmniCube would joke about like, Bitcoin price. I don't know, just trying to like sort of like use a sort of game setting
Uh huh.
type of GIF or whatever, and sort of try to make it integrated with sort of like whatever is going on the internet that sort of day or week. And so that like some people responded really well to
Yeah,
that.
I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, so that was a lot of fun. And yeah, but to be honest, like we definitely could and should do more social media stuff for OmniCube, but it was tough after like 4 years working on it. There's definitely a lot of burnout by the end of the release cycle, and we were just
I
sort of like,
bet.
okay,
Yeah.
all parties involved need a break from OmniCube. So
Right.
it's been a
Right.
little quiet over the last month or so, just as we all sort of like take a vacation from it. But it's something we definitely are going to keep working on.
And if any of you are interested, his social media for the game is actually down in the description, so you should see that if you want to follow that. They
Yeah,
have
check it out.
Facebook group, and Twitter, so definitely follow that.
Yeah, check it out.
So, do you plan on? Is this a one-off thing for Trykon Studios, or is there something bigger and better coming in the future?
Yeah, so for sure, like the longer we go, the more I'm getting involved in Trek, so I'm very excited. I've got one of the crazy things about OmniCube was like I had so many other projects I wanted to work on, and I tried to be very disciplined in the sense that until I release my first commercial game, I can't let myself work on other stuff. And I would do
Right.
game jams and stuff, but it was all OmniCube all the time when I had game development time. And so now that OmniCube's over, um, I've got a lot of projects I would love to work on. One of my dream games would be to work on sort of like a 2D Zelda type game. That's probably one of my favorite games I've ever played, particularly like on the Game Boy Color.
Mm-hmm.
You had these very simple sort of like pixel art, and it was the sort of usual Zelda formula. And so I would love to make something in that vein. There's a tremendous game that was released in the last year or two called Blossom Tales, I think it's called, and it's
Okay, yeah, I heard
basically
that.
yeah, it's sort of like a 2D Zelda, but it's set through a really cool framing device of it's a grandfather telling a bedtime story to his granddaughter, and so as you're going through, like it's sort of narrated from that point of view. So as
Yeah,
you're
that's cool.
adventuring
Uh
through,
huh.
she's like, wait, Grandpa, what was around this corner? And they're like, I guess it was 100 goblins, and then like a bunch of goblins show up, and you have to fight them.
Oh,
So,
that's
so
awesome. Yeah.
even though Zelda is sort of like a very like, there's a lot of Zelda-like games. I feel like when I saw that, I was like, wow, like even all these years later, you really can put like a pretty unique spin on it. So
Right.
I would love to make something like that. Um, what I think I'm probably going to work on next is actually before I made OmniCube, I was doing a project where I would make one game a week. There's this tremendous article written by Rami Ismail. Um, he's sort of well known in the indie space where he said like the best way to sort of improve as a developer like is completing projects.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said like his the guy he collaborates with makes like 100 small games a year.
Wow.
Just very, very, very small games. But there's something to be said for like thinking about a game and finishing a project and sort of knowing everything that goes into that
Mm-hmm.
and going through the process of finishing 100 games versus say you work for 2 years on one big project. Well, even though it's probably much more impressive, you've only really finished one game. And so he recommended like if you really want to sort of improve your skills as a developer and try out a bunch of ideas, try making one game a week. And it's almost like a weekly game jam, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that actually for a number of weeks before I started OmniCube. And it was probably the most fun I ever had as a developer, just like starting a new thing like every Sunday or Monday and just like being like, what am I going to make this week? Like, I'm going to make like sort of like an arcade sort of action game, or like the next week, I'm going to make like a very intimate narrative based game. And I would very much love to do that again, like in the very near future. I think I'm going to be starting doing one game a week again sometime in like the next month or month and a half. So I'm really, really excited about that. And
That's awesome.
probably what I'll do is make like 8 or 10 or 12 games, and then whichever one sort of seems like the most promising game to sort of like take commercially or sort of invest more time in, I'll probably pick one of those and then work on it in a very serious way, the way we did for OmniCube.
So do you have like a website where you put these, or how can people find those?
Yeah, it's let me see here. I was doing some web development stuff recently, and I can't remember if I actually uh, this is an answer I really should have. Yeah, right now it redirects to our itch page, but we did have a website where we were sort of hosting some of these prototypes at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Right around the release of OmniCube, we just wanted everything all OmniCube all the time. So
Right.
my website, tryconstudios.com, right now just redirects to our itch page.
Okay.
But I'll probably do something similar where I'll because I want to very much like have these where people can sort of see what I'm working on and see the prototypes. So I do plan on probably spinning up like an itch page dedicated to it, or maybe an itch page per game. I'm not sure exactly how to organize it, but if you are following on either the Facebook page or Twitter, I'll definitely make that available, because one of the fun things about OmniCube that I'd never had with any of the other games, of course, is like actually having people, like a decent number of people play it and interact about the game and sort of give feedback. And it's a very intoxicating thing, compared to making these private sort of prototypes, and you show them to a few friends, but really not that many people are playing them. So I'm
Yeah.
very excited to when I sort of get the one game a week up and running again to share some of the prototypes with people.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So when I was playing, I actually thought that the OmniCube game could translate to mobile very very easily, or not easily, but very well. Has
Yeah.
that is that something you've thought of? Is it something you've done?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it definitely does. It's very natural. You're just clicking and
Right.
sliding.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely translates to mobile really well. It's probably so. A lot of people have asked the same question, and ultimately, um, the problem we faced is the UI is a little bit busy when you translate it down to a smaller screen, because you sort of
Okay.
have like a 14 by 14 grid, and even if
Uh-huh.
it's smaller, like you can sort of get the fat finger thing where you're clicking, but there's a block, one space above it, and you
Yeah.
sort of.
Yeah.
So it didn't really, like, maybe on a tablet it fit really well, but particularly on phones, like we definitely did a lot of testing on phones, and it was sort of hard to control. And I've been thinking a lot about ways to translate it to mobile in a natural way
Mm-hmm.
where it feels good and you're not accidentally misclicking stuff. And so we definitely plan on doing an OmniCube mobile release at some point.
Here to here
Um,
first.
Absolutely, this is exclusive news.
Yeah,
Breaking Trykon
breaking
Studios
news.
announcement. Yeah, and a lot of people have mentioned that they would like to see it on mobile, and I would too. But it didn't. It was like we made our game in Unity, and so Unity allows you to export to a lot of different platforms very easily, and so we definitely did spin up some mobile builds, and it just never really translated that easily, even though it is a natural fit for mobile. And so I went back and forth and like, well, maybe we should just launch it for all these platforms at once. And we ultimately decided that it'd be better to get the game out in some capacity and then do the mobile launch later rather
Right.
than wait and try to launch it all at once because we'd already been on such a big delay, since 2014. I was like, it's going to be hopefully coming soon. And so we just ultimately decided to focus on launching it for for PC and Mac. And then, yeah, I guess I can't really commit to a timetable, especially since, this 3 month game took me 4 years to make. But
Yeah.
OmniCube on mobile is definitely going to be happening.
That's awesome because I could totally see knocking out a level while you're sitting there or something, and then going on about your business and then knocking out another level. I could that I think that would be a
100,
great
yeah,
for
100%. It's a
mobile.
great point, and it is a great fit. So it'll 100% be happening at some point. Hopefully
Awesome.
not another 4 years.
You heard it here first. So we're coming up on the hour mark here, so we're gonna start wrapping up here. So I do have a
Absolutely.
few questions for you though.
Sure.
So how would you describe this game to somebody that doesn't play video games or doesn't know anything about puzzle games? How would you describe it to
That's a fun question. So
them?
my sort of elevator pitch is it's a really hard block sliding puzzle game. If someone was not even understanding that, I would say, it's like sliding chess pieces around a board. That's something everyone can relate to.
Yeah.
That's sort of the ethos of the game.
And like I said again, that makes total sense now that you say
Yeah.
that. So what was the hardest part in development? What was the most difficult roadblock for you?
Ooh, trying to get the UI to look and feel good, and that's from an art standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
because like I've already covered quite extensively, but also just from there's a lot of small programmatic tweaks that have to happen for a UI to feel responsive. Like you take for granted that when a button can be clicked, it's going to light up, and when you change levels, there's a nice transition, and
Mm-hmm.
like I spent probably a month programming the mechanics of the game, and I spent you know at least 3 months, 4 months of just tweaking UI and making little programmatic things. So getting the UI to feel and look good is, I mean, for sure was like 90% of the development. Yeah.
Yeah. So any funny stories on game breaking bugs or any hit your head against the wall?
Yeah, I mean, so many. Uh, we have an intro scene where you sort of transition from like the Omnicubes talking, and then you sort of move, and then the puzzles begin. And that code ended up getting called in the wrong place a bunch of times. So we would have someone like finish a level, and then half the geometry just translates off the screen. It's like that's not supposed to happen. Um, yeah, and then just a lot of really crazy UI stuff where like you'd switch from one side of the cube to the other, and it's like you're expecting a level, and it's like the omnicube face, or like the buttons, the level select screen is like in the wrong place. There's a lot of like sort of layout stuff, but yeah, a lot of the problems with omnicube, a lot of the bugs were just like, oh, the UI is not doing anything that I expect. It's not really like funny so much as just like maddening.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So what is one piece of advice? I know you already said some. You've already said a couple pieces of advice, but for somebody who wants to develop a game, what is your one piece of advice you would say? I wish I had done this.
Yeah. You hear it all the time, and yet no one seems to be able to follow it. Scope your game as small as you can possibly imagine, and then make it smaller. Like, scoping your game tightly is the most important thing. And as sort of a side piece of advice, don't let people talk you out of whatever your vision is for the game, in terms of like people were like, oh, you should have in-app purchases. You should make it look like this. You should do this and this. And I would end up saying, hey, that's a really good point. And I would change the game. And then the next person would be like, why did you change that? So there's everyone's going to have an opinion on your game. Just execute it the way that you think it should be done, and then it's going to be done. Because if you try and change it to every piece of advice you hear from everybody, you'll end up making a game that should take 3 months over 4 years.
Yeah.
So scope your games, everyone. Scope them tightly.
Well, there you have it. All right. Well, this has been In-Depth Vicinities with Kyle from Trykon Studios. Any last messages for the viewers?
Uh, Everybody play OmniCube and go Texans go, right?
Yeah, that's my man. All right. We'll see you next time.
All right, it was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Well, I will end it here in a second.